But I'm not going to talk about that. Nicolas is doing the introduction, so I think maybe I should introduce myself. I'm Siraj Mohammed. I'm here at BITS with something called the Corporate Strategy and Industrial Development Research Program. And I'll Nick introduce himself and introduce the workshop. Thank you.
Good morning. Good morning.
Yes.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Nicolas. I also work at CSIB with Siraj. First of all, I'd like to thank you all for coming to this workshop today. We were very, with Holdt and Karl, we were very impressed with the response to the invitation. So we tried to ensure that we could accommodate everybody, seeing the group filling out quickly. So hopefully everybody will be able to sit. And we really hope that today will be worth your time. We're very grateful today to come and be with us, and we look forward to the discussions today. What we aim to do is to engage the political economy in South Africa in a critical way today. One of the reasons for this is that it seems to us that in the past 20-25 years, critical scholarship, and it's something, it's a point that Bishop Palienti makes in a couple of papers he did in the 1990s and the 2000s. A number of critical scholars have increasingly started working for or with the alliance or the government. And this, of course, is very understandable. I think it was linked to the enthusiasm caused by the victory of the ANC and its allies, which led a lot of people to think, well, we want to participate. We want to participate in building a new country. And I think this temptation to participate was very compelling. We do feel, however, that 20 years down the line, it's becoming more and more urgent to have a critical view from outside, a critical political economy analysis that tries to reunite with some of the critical scholarship that South Africa was so famous for in the 1970s and 1980s, in order to make sense of a number of things which, quite frankly, we can't really make sense from within. Something that's striking, I think, is that when there is critical scholarship towards, for example, the government and the alliance, some of it tends to come from former lefties who've gradually, over the years, drifted to the center, some of them going all the way to the right. And certainly the kind of scholarship that comes from them, in my view, is certainly not helpful in understanding what kinds of challenges this country is facing. Let me give you an example that I read recently. I don't know if some of you came across the study that Dave Kaplan, one of these people who has drifted, I suppose, wrote for the very left-wing Center for Development and Enterprise. Now, in this study, Kaplan basically looks at the Industrial Policy Action Plan, the National Development Plan, and the New Growth Path, and argues that South Africa's economic policy framework is incoherent, that there are contradictions, in particular between IPAP and the NDP on the one hand and the NDP on the other side. Now, what I can promise you is that today we're going to do a bit better than this in terms of method analysis, than just pointing out that this incoherence, without any attempt, if you read the paper, actually uncovering why there is this incoherence, what kinds of class forces or class alliances may be explaining why you have contradictory policy frameworks. And in particular, one thing that's missing from Kaplan's analysis, I think quite glaringly so, is that there's absolutely no engagement with the fact that two of these frameworks really are largely pieces of paper. I mean, there's a very clear difference in the influence, in the relationship between actual policy and one of these documents, and very little when it comes to the other two. So there's very little in the kind of analysis that comes from this, let's say, this neoclassical scholarship on South Africa, you know. Now, we are convinced that South Africa's challenges warrant a critical look at questions which may be very uncomfortable, and in particular very uncomfortable for a number of people who've been involved in the past 15, 20, 25 years in this kind of, how can we call it, scholarship from within, critical scholarship from within. Not least questions such as why the ANC, in spite of mounting pressures, criticism, and towering evidence of failure of a number of its policies, doesn't seem ready to change the substance of general policy orientation. To explore this, we will look at a number of dimensions of the political economy of South Africa, which you can see on the program, which reflect a number of studies that were part of a rural project about which I'll talk now. We will start by talking about the role with Karl, the role of violence in contesting and reproducing the social order in South Africa, and the emergence of what Karl calls a violent democracy that contradicts a lot of the dominant frameworks on what we understand democracy to be. Then we'll look with Judy Makaya and Simon Roberts at the way in which corporate structures have been challenged or rather often reproduced through the new competition regime that was established in South Africa in the 1990s. Then we'll look at the reasons why macroeconomic policy still seems largely, as we say with Aurelius again, stuck in stabilization mode, and the implications of the influence of the national treasury over government policy and government capacity at large. Then we'll look at black economic empowerment and its role in redistribution and the selective inclusion of new capitalists. And at the end of the day, we will present, Aurelia, Karl, and I, a transversal paper, which is basically in many ways the result of our effort at looking at a number of dimensions of the political economy of South Africa. Where we'll try to draw some conclusions and hopefully to stimulate some debates about what we feel could be a critical analysis of South Africa's political economy 20 years after 1994. And of course, what we'll be trying to do throughout the day is to answer the provocative but in our view extremely important question, which I think is at the heart of the discomfort. Is South Africa a case of developmental failure? They tried, they didn't manage. Or is there something different going on here? Is there actually a success, but a success of a different kind? That's of what we call neoliberal deepening. Now, a few words are in order about where this project comes from, where these different papers come from. Most of them are part, actually all of the ones that will be presented today, are part of the South African case study of a broader project funded by the French Development Agency, the research department, which looked in total at 9 countries, including Brazil, Burkina Faso, China, Vietnam, and a number of others. These studies follow from another set of case studies. I think we might have one of the authors here today, which looked at 7 countries and which was funded by the World Bank. These studies were published in a book called In the Shadow of Violence, Politics, Economics, and the Problems of Development, published by CEP. All of these case studies, including the South African one of their objectives, apart from generating new knowledge on the political economy of these countries, which was a great opportunity, was to assess the validity of a new conceptual framework, very ambitious conceptual framework, which was developed by Douglas North, the new institutional economist and Nobel Prize winner, and Wallace and Weingast, in 2009, a book called Violence and Social Orders, which in many ways I think is a forerunner of the, I see it in every bookshop now, the bestseller by Asamoah and Robinson. The key insights from the Violence and Social Order book, but we'll go back to this throughout the day, is that developing countries are organized in order to mitigate the threat of violence through elite arrangements. And I suppose the key insights in terms of relating to neoclassical analysis from this book is to say that in some cases, unproductive rents, so the distribution of rents in order to ensure, for example, peace and stability can be highly necessary and are not necessarily things that should be wiped out, let's say, by anti-corruption measures. So there's a very subtle analysis of the way in which elite coalitions in developing countries are organized. We have, and I think a lot of case studies in the AFD part of the project, we have looked at this framework critically, but we've also looked at another framework that I think has influenced the work of Douglas North and his team, which is then developed by a heterodox economist called Mushtaq Khan, based at SOAS in London, which he calls the political settlement framework, which shares some similarities with North, but has also a number of interesting differences. And one of the things we'll try to do in our overview paper is to also try and reflect on their respective validity. Now, I'm almost done, but I just wanted to say that today we have a number of the presenters or people who did the case studies. A lot of these case studies were published, as you would know, in this special issue of the Review of African Political Economy. We've ordered a number of them, and we hope most of you, many of you, will be able to get one. We were hoping everyone, but I don't know if that will be possible. We hope so. You'll see that there's one person missing. Unfortunately, he couldn't be here today. It's Karl, who did a paper on social policy. But we do have today with us Roger Salvo, who was part of the project and who's done the paper on black economic empowerment. Together with these authors and presenters, we've tried to put together, I think, a very exciting number of chairs, of course, but also of discussants. Mark Heywood, Gavin Capps, a number of people from a variety of organizations who I think will provide interesting critical points in the different papers and hopefully kickstart discussions. What we're hoping to do today is really to have an exchange with you. So you'll see from the way the program is set up, for each presentation there's 25 minutes followed by 5 minutes of discussion, and hopefully everybody will manage to, including myself, often the worst one at this, will manage to stick to time so that we can have for each session 45 minutes question, comments and exchanges with the group. So hopefully the chair will manage to enforce this quickly. Right, I think that's all I wanted to say, so thank you very much, and now I'll pass it over to Karl.
Thanks, Nick. Can you put this on? And I think this needs to be plugged in. I think I will move forward. Thanks. Can I check with you whether I'm blocking your sight of the slides? Well, because if I am, we can move the table a bit and I can move a bit to the side. So speak up now or never. No.
Karl, I'll be waving this from the side.
Okay, great. Thanks. I'm not sure that helps very much, but I'll tell you what's on the slides if you can't see. Great, thanks Nick, and thanks Siraj, and in advance thanks to Mark Heywood for engaging again in this discussion that we've been having over about a year or more about the nature of our democracy. So this is a kind of an ongoing dialogue. Right, so what I'm going to cover today, I'm going to talk a little bit about the political settlement, 1994, and the new constitution and what they signify about South Africa. Then I'm going to move on to talk about intra-elite competition and violence. And then finally touch on the prospects going into the future. So firstly, a little bit of a discussion of the kind of framework that Nick alluded to. The framework that is used by North Wallace and Waingast, and in their later book with West as well, for trying to understand violence and competition amongst elites in developing countries. So the first point is that the key dynamic to understand in the politics of developing countries like South Africa is the question of elite formation, elite coalitions, how the elite is formed, and the competition within the elite for rents, otherwise known in our kind of popular discourse, I suppose, as corruption. But I think our entire discussion today is really about questioning the kind of common sense view of what corruption is, and really to talk about it in a different way. A second theme in the analysis is the question of violent capabilities. As you all know, the assumption that we hold about the modern state is that it monopolizes the coercion, monopolizes violence in society. They question this, we question this, and we look at those actors that have violent capabilities beyond the state. And we argue that it's really important to understand the distribution of violent capability across society in order to understand what the nature of politics. And the nature of the elite coalition and the kind of competition and the kind of agreements amongst the elite makes for the stability or instability of the social order. And finally, I suppose these dynamics, these questions of the relations between different elite factions, the distribution of rents or patronage networks, and violence all make up if you like, an unofficial but very present, very real political system that operates within as well as alongside as well as outside the formal political, the official political framework of democracy. So we have this sort of relationship between an unofficial set of political relationships and the kind of more formal constitutional ones. So to try and sort of very briefly sum up what is the meaning of the political settlement, which is enshrined in the Constitution. Well, the Constitution protects private property and protects it rather strongly. The Constitution also involves a dispersal of power across different institutions in the state. So there's a relatively high degree of decentralization, both at the provincial level. We've got a quasi-federal model, not a fully federal one, but then also to the local government level. And this creates a very complex political system with powers distributed across a range of institutions. And then in other ways as well, for example, the independence of the Reserve Bank. At the same time, the Constitution enshrines a range of rights. And a pretty key and important one is the recognition of past injustice and the kind of past distribution, particularly of land, and a kind of injunction on the democratic regime to look at a restitution of those rights and those accesses that have been denied through apartheid. So there's a fairly strong provision with potential in it for the redistribution of land. And then there are all the other social rights, the right to water, to health, to life, and so on and so forth, to housing. And those are very strongly elaborated in the Constitution. And then if we're discussing or looking or interrogating the question of the relationship between, rather the question of violence in South Africa, it's quite important to pay attention to the relation between violence and the Constitution. So here I really want to just make 2 points. And the one is that the period of negotiation of the new Constitution was quite arguably at least one of the most violent periods in South African history. The number of people who were killed in that period, in that short period, exceeds the number of people killed in the entire kind of anti-apartheid struggle in the 1980s. So it was a very violent period out of which the Constitution lived. But moreover, the kind of property relations that are enshrined and protected through the property clause in the Constitution is based on 3.5 centuries of violent conquest, of violent dispossession, of the violence of the Land Acts, the violence of the pass laws, the kind of accumulated wealth and the accumulated ownership of capital in South Africa, the racially accumulated wealth is really sort of in some sense was locked in by the Constitution and underlies the Constitution. And here, I think it's a very vivid portrayal of Pierre Bourdieu's sort of statement at quite an abstract level that a constitution, and he's talking generally, the Constitution, not in South Africa in general, is a founding fiction designed to disguise the act of lawless violence, which is the basis for the establishment of law. The act of lawless violence, 300 years of colonial dispossession, which is the basis for the establishment of law, the new constitution. And then on top of that, the ANC adopts conservative economic policy, does not take up some of the opportunities that are present in the constitution, particularly around land. And so we don't really know what the constitution is capable of in terms of redistribution because of the kind of policy positions adopted here. So to go back to the model that we're using in this, that I'm using in this analysis, the result is a relative insulation of the economy from politics. So on this side of the screen, I think it's on this side of your screen, the white-dominated economy, and then on the other side of the screen, the ANC and black-dominated polity, with a whole lot of insulation taking place between those two spheres, with bridges. Limited bridges provided by BEE and land reform. And there'll be more discussion of BEE later today. But the question is, how limited is this and what's possible within it? So a consequence of this is that the state becomes the source of redistribution. If you can't really engage with the white-dominated economy, if that is protected and if there's no way that you can make inroads into that except through these limited bridges, then the state itself, with its massive control of assets, of revenues, of huge actual payrolls, a huge kind of employed constituency and so on, that becomes the site of competition within the new black elite for access to economic resources. The state appears to monopolize violence capability. In the settlement, as we know, the liberation armies, MK and so on, were absorbed into a new national defense force, which included the old apartheid defense force. So, on the face of it, we have a state that monopolizes the coercive capacity, but we have an increasing proliferation of factions within the ANC struggling over access to these rents and resources. Now, at that point, that's sort of the settlement part of my presentation. At this point, I'm going to start talking about violence within the state and within the elite. How much more time have I got, Siraj? Where am I on my time plan?
You've used about 10 minutes.
Okay, so what I'm going to cover 4 different elements of violence here. Struggles for the control of the state institutions of coercion, assassination, the mobilization of collective violence, and then finally the question of breaching the insulation of white capital and wealth that is set up through the settlement. So firstly, to look at controlling the state, and I'm not sure, can you guys at the back see what's on the cartoon at the bottom? Shows Judge Sariti, who, as you know, is investigating the arms deal. You've got him wound up and heading off with his binoculars, looking for evidence. Of course, all the evidence is behind him. It's a great mountain of evidence, and he's going off into the distance in a different direction. So that's some of the, one of the ways in which the law can be used to seem to actually flush out what's called corruption, but actually to protect it. To sort of pull the wool over all of our eyes. Now, in the top right-hand corner, we see Glynis Breitenbach, prosecutor in the NPA. This is a really interesting story, and it's a very tangled story. She was investigating 2 cases. She was the prosecutor on 2 cases. The one is to do with Richard Ndluli, who's next to her there, who is a senior guy in the police force, the head of police intelligence, and was being investigated by her on murder charges and corruption charges. Below her you see a giant vehicle at Kumba Iron Ore. This was the second case she was investigating. And this has to do with, again, a fairly complex case in which a black economic empowerment company got hold through fraudulent means, through the Department of Mineral Affairs, of the license to mine the iron ore that Kumba mines. And this led to a massive dispute over that license. So she was investigating that case as well. Now, she was suspended. And she was suspended quite dramatically, and she was charged with misconduct in the Kumba iron ore case. But she always argued that the reason she was suspended was because she was investigating Richard Ndluli, who it turned out was a very powerful figure in the police force, who had written a letter to the president, to President Zuma, and submitted a dossier alleging that Bheki Cele, the head of the cops, was involved with other senior police in a plot against both Zuma and Nathi Mthethwa, the Minister of Police. So in the bottom photograph, we have Bheki Cele, Nathi Mthethwa, and the President, to show some of those linkages. Now what happened, there was this, okay, so several things are happening at the same time. The prosecutor is suspended and charged with misconduct. Ndluli, who had been suspended, was reinstated. And Cele, who also had another case against him, not a case, but rather allegations of corruption in relation to the buildings that the police occupied, was finally dismissed, was finally got rid of. So Ndluli was victorious in that one. And he was also victorious in the NPA because the prosecution was suspended. But over time what happened, Glynis Breitenbach had to face a disciplinary inquiry. She came out of that with all the charges dismissed, was reinstated into the NPA, but kept off the cases. She was sent to shuttled off to different cases. Ndluli was only resuspended because some NGO actually came with a court case to have him resuspended. The BEE company in relation to Kumba was found guilty of fraud. What it turned out that in fact they were not interested in mining the ore, they were interested in selling the rights to the ore. And ArcelorMittal had actually guaranteed to buy those rights for 800 million rand. If the company could hold on to those rights, but because of the court case, I think at the current stage they've lost those rights. Trudy and Simon might be able to clarify the current status of that case. But what this demonstrates is the really complex set of struggles within the NPA and the police and the intelligence agencies over the kinds of power and authority and the way the law is applied or not applied in this range of cases. So I think that this shows the kind of entanglements. And of course the struggles over this are made more complicated by the question of race in relation to these actors. So to summarize, what we have is an unofficial political system which involves subversion of the law in order to distribute rents in this kind of way. The prosecuting authority, the police and the intelligence agencies are all sites of struggle in terms of control. And there are questions relating to the judiciary and whether there are attempts to make inroads there as well. This way of using the law amounts to selective state violence against targeted individuals. And so to give you an example, Malema, there were plenty of accusations that Malema was involved in corruption against so-called in Limpopo, but no charges, there appeared to be no action against him until he fell out of favor with the ANC. And then the machinery of state started to move and has charged him with fraud and a whole lot of other things, and we know what's happening now in relation to that. The same can be said in relation to Zuma. He was targeted at a certain point, a series of struggles took place, and those charges disappeared. And then finally, the point must be made that white capital is involved in these processes as well. Tails was very involved in the arms deal, and the white construction company is another kind of case of this type of process. Secondly, assassinations. There's been an increase in assassinations, in political assassinations in South Africa. What this photograph shows is the mayor of Rustenburg in Northwest, who was found guilty with his bodyguard of murdering a councillor in Rustenburg. The councillor had submitted a dossier about corruption to the police. That dossier has never re-emerged. And that says something about assassination. So again, those are the two in the photograph there. The headline next to them is about that case. The one below, assassinated Chief Wood, a savvy fixer. That's a case from Mpumalanga some years ago. The whole very complex set of allegations around that one. And then the one on the top left-hand side, again, we go back to Northwest Province, to Rustenburg, where the police, just after Mangaung, arrested the MEC, who was also the deputy chairperson, and others over a pre-conference.